At the beginning of the story, set in the small town of Black Creek, one of the cities in the United States that has been hit by a long dry season for years, right after the end of the Civil War, which lasted for 3 years. This long drought condition is considered a disaster by the townspeople of Black Creek. There are even those who think that is a curse, due to the actions of the mayor, who treats his citizens very cruelly, even oppressing and punishing them as he wants. Nevertheless, the townspeople had no power to argue. They seem to understand very well what happens if they are desperate to fight back, because of course the mayor is the ruler who makes all forms of rules that apply in the small town. However, behind the fear of all people against the prevailing rules, it turns out that there is a man who braved to oppose the cruelty and savagery of the rulers, a priest named Thomas McCord. Because of his courage, he even pointed to the faces of these elements one by one, deliberately humiliating them in front of his congregation. Until one night, located still in the church, a location that became the starting point for the terrible events of all the stories that have ever existed. Inside, Pastor Thomas is seen writing a letter to a United States Air Force Marshal who is none other than the pastor's own brother. The letter he wrote was about how the situation and conditions in the Black Creek town getting worse than before. The government, which is supposed to nurture and protect its citizens, become an evil figure who terrorizes and oppresses its own citizens. In the midst of completing the contents of his letter, Thomas was suddenly surprised by the arrival of a woman named Mrs. Ginny, who was the mistress of a trusted accomplice of the mayor. Where the man did not hesitate to oppress and even kill anyone without mercy, especially those who had usurped and demeaned his dignity. Apart from all that, Mrs. Ginny came to get spiritual guidance from the priest. The life she led as a mistress had tired her out, so she wanted to break free from the shackles of the vicious circle that plunged her into sin. At first, Thomas seemed to accept Ginny's arrival in this late-night situation. He just wanted to prevent people's perception of him, especially since Ginny was known to be the mistress of the Black Creek ruler. Ginny's hug landed in Thomas' arms. Of course, it made Thomas shocked and horrified, because of course his togetherness with Ginny at that time was not at a correct moment. And sure enough, Thomas's anxiety about it actually happened, where Reb, who is the mayor's trusted accomplice, suddenly broke into the church door just as Ginny, his mistress, released her embrace from Thomas' body. But unfortunately, Reb doesn't seem to take Ginny's clarification for granted. It was evident where one of his men hit with a gun right on the back of Thomas' head, make Thomas fall to the floor. Despite realizing that death would soon pick him up, it didn't scare Thomas in the slightest. Instead, he began to pray and continuously. In fact, his faith became even stronger and unshakable when Reb began to spill a bottle of gasoline on Thomas' clothes and then lit it with a match. Make Thomas burn. Not far away, Major Pierce, the mayor, was watching the incident with a cold expression. He lit a cigarette, seemingly in full support of the arrogance and anarchy that his men had just committed. And that is the story of the movie Justice Has Began. 1 month later, after the horrific incident, the story will focus on a man named James McCord, who is none other than the brother of the late Thomas. At this time, Marshal James had just returned from the battlefield. He made good on his promise to visit Thomas, not knowing that his brother had been slaughtered by the unholy lords of Black Creek. After a while of spurring his horse through the sandy hills, James finally arrived there and immediately entered the downtown, where his arrival was immediately greeted by a scene that was so sad and very concerning. He witnessed a young man being dragged to the whipping post who had no idea what he had done, but certainly no one there wanted to prevent and defend the young man. Seeing this, James was moved to help. He loudly shouted, telling the young man to be released with the concrete reason that the Civil War had ended. Without a fight, the cowardly cowboys were forced to retreat. After believing that the situation had become conducive, James continued his journey by visiting a bar that was still in the downtown. Upon entering the bar and ordering a drink, James was interrupted by 2 tough guy thugs to surrounding him. One of them blatantly asked James to hand over the cowboy hat he was wearing. Hearing this, James calmly tried to respond humanely. But one of them was even more badly, where he tried to snatch the hat from James' head. But who would have thought the incident was witnessed directly by Reb and some of his men who happened to be there? He looked sharply at James, showing his dislike as well as wondering who James really was. At that moment, they finally found out who James really was. His face began to change slightly, showing anxiety when he realized that James was a U.S. Marshal. His anxiety also led his footsteps to immediately meet with the mayor. He told the mayor that James was not a random person, where his actions as the highest leader of the United States Air Force troops would definitely be an obstacle to their future plans, especially if James knew that they were the ones who had killed his brother. But the mayor tried to calm Reb down, asking him not to worry too much. That's because he believes that James will suspect that his brother's death was just an accident. Meanwhile, James could arrive at the site of the charred church building. He got off his horse and approached a woman named Melissa, who was known to be a religion teacher or catechist. At that very moment, Melissa also ended the lesson, telling the children to go home. After that, Melissa introduced herself and asked who James was and what he came there for. When Melissa took him to meet Thomas, how surprised James was when Melissa took him to a grave with a wooden cross bearing Thomas' name. So James finally knew that his brother had died a month ago. The death of the brother that must be flooded with tears evolves into anger and wrath, as evidenced where James grabs Thomas's grave soil by squeezing and sprinkling it back. With that symbolic, make grief and anger mixed into one. The beautiful Melissa then kindly offers James a ride to stay at her parents' cottage. Without refusing the kindness, James took Melissa on his horse, and off they both went. To make a long story short, in the afternoon Melissa invited James to have a dinner, and she introduced him to her parents, until there was a very warm communication. The polite, mature, and authoritative speech that radiated in James make Melissa's father and mother look so very fond of him. So in the middle of their conversation, they often teased Melissa as a sign that they wanted James to be their daughter's soulmate. Seeing the teasing from her parents, of course, made Melissa smile blushingly, which expression can already prove that Melissa, since the beginning of meeting, has secretly put her heart into James. Meanwhile, located in a secret mining site, a place that is the source of the birth of the evil of the ruler and his minions. It is in this mining site Major Pierce hides illegally imported weapons. In the evening, Melissa handed a box to James, where the box could certainly belong to Thomas, who was accidentally found by Melissa under the rubble of the church building. Unnoticed, the night was getting late. When everyone had fallen asleep, James opened Thomas' journal, which was one of the objects in the box. In the journal, the secret that the late Thomas had been hiding was revealed, which at that time he accidentally followed Major Pierce to a former mining site filled with weapons. Realizing the mayor's unusual stockpiling of weapons, Thomas suspected that behind it all there was an evil plan being built by Major Pierce. So Thomas took the initiative to make a map by describing the location of the mining site. The next morning, while walking his horse through the downtown, James accidentally saw a black man who was a blacksmith being intimidated by two of Reb's men, just because he could not pay the land rent. At that very moment, James immediately got off his horse, pointed a gun at them, and threatened them to leave the man immediately. But instead of going home and ending their activities, Reb's two men this time approached a woman, forcing her with harsh words to pay the tax money immediately. Yet again, they did not realize that James had come and chased them away for the second time. Moving on from there, James then entered the bar he had visited earlier, and in there he happened to see a naval officer with the rank of captain, who from his face, James felt familiar with the captain's figure. Intrigued by his figure, James ordered 2 glasses of whiskey. Then he approached the captain's table and entertained him with the whiskey he ordered. So there was a conversation in which it turned out that they had both been placement in the same war location area. The captain, whose name was Captain Lewis, said that the purpose of his arrival in the Black Creek town was inseparable from the rumors circulating about weapons smuggling activities entering the Black Creek town. So he was sent to keep an eye on Major Pierce's movements. Of course, up to this point, the United States Navy's main command had begun to detect irregularities in the small town. At the same time, located in the mayor's residence, Reb's men reported that the priest brother they had killed was acting up more and more, where James obstructed their activities when collecting rent from the townspeople. Hearing this, the mayor immediately looked troubled, so he told Reb to find someone reliable and experienced, which of course was to keep an eye on James' movements. In the afternoon, James met Melissa, who was working at the farm. There, he told Melissa that he found something in Thomas's journal. It was a sheet of maps depicting directions to a secret mining site, containing stolen weapons and money. After traveling for several hours, James finally could find the mining site, according to the directions on the map. Where the mining site turned out to be just below the foot of the hill. When he went inside, James found a number of gold coins that were suspected of being stolen. But unfortunately, just as James wanted to continue searching, he suddenly heard the voices of several guards, who seemed to realize that the mining site had been entered by someone. It didn't take long for the explosion in the mining site that killed the guard to be discovered by Reb. So he went to Mayor Pierce to convey this information. Reb told the mayor that the culprit was James, the brother of the priest they killed. However, the information conveyed by Reb actually made the mayor even more upset. He looked so very angry because Reb was hired and paid, of course, to do something according to his expectations. The pressure he got from the mayor made Reb lose control, so when one of his men came to see him without permission, Reb lightly killed his men. In the evening, James was visited by Mrs. J to talk, but James, who was not interested at first, eventually responded about his brother. Then James went in the direction of the stables, and when he got there, James heard Ginny asking what he wanted to say. But unfortunately, Ginny set him up with a gang of Reb's men and James was knocked unconscious down. Unknowns how long James was unconscious in the stables, but certainly when he woke up, he realized that he was currently being treated by Melissa. At that moment, Melissa told James that James should end his mission. That's because Melissa didn't want James to end up like Thomas, who died in vain because he had disturbed the Lord. However, James refused Melissa's request. He did not want to waste the death of Thomas, who had gone so far to fight for justice to expose the rottenness of the ruler, all because of his desire to return the Black Creek town to peace. At the same time, at the sovereign's residence, Reb told Major Pierce that as long as James was still traveling around in the Black Creek town, it was certain that their situation would be even more endangered. Therefore, Reb tried to come up with a solution that James should just be eliminated. However, the mayor refused. That's because it would raise the suspicion of the Naval Command Unit, which incidentally James is a United States Marshal who has a solid position in his unit. In the midst of the mayor's dilemma and despair, he suddenly got an idea. Where he entered his office and took a 1-star pin, which meant that he unilaterally appointed Reb to be a sheriff, which of course Reb's position would be considered and legal in the law. Unnoticed, time continues to pass. As time goes by, the seeds of love between James and Melissa grow like flowers blooming in spring. However, in the midst of intimacy, James and Melissa were immediately shocked when Reb and his men suddenly appeared at gunpoint. Where right in front of Melissa, Reb slandered James and accused him of raping Mrs. Ginny. Reb also slandered the late Thomas for doing the same thing. Reb, who is now a sheriff, makes it easy for him to arrest James. In fact, James himself was unable to deny the accusation. His hands were tied, then dragged and wrapped in a plastic bag filled with garbage. Then James was tied to a whipping post to be humiliated in the middle of a crowd of townspeople. Seeing the incident, Melissa could no longer hold back from speak up. With teary eyes, she begged the mayor to let James go, because James was innocent. However, listening to Melissa's request, Major Pierce actually confirmed the accusation. That's because, of course, Major Pierce itself was the one who had planned the accusation. Meanwhile, Mrs. Ginny was seen regretting her actions, because the truth was that she was no choice to slander James at the insistence and coercion of the Lord, so right away she decided to run away and leave the small town of Black Creek. However, the plan was discovered by Reb. Reb, of course, looked so furious that without pity, Reb viciously killed Ginny on the spot. At the same time, the the bonds on James' hands were finally released. James fell helplessly in Melissa's arms, then was dragged back and put into the prison cell. Melissa's feelings seemed to be shattered into pieces. The handsome man who had just filled the empty spaces in her heart now had to feel the savagery of the city ruler. With a very fragile condition, Melissa went and begged her father to get James out of prison. But the father refused his only daughter's request, because helping James was the same as against the ruler. However, Melissa continued to beg and plead with her father. This made her father finally couldn't bear it. So the next morning, he gathered some of the residents, asking them to come together near an old church. It was to discuss something important for the betterment of Black Creek townspeople live. Eventually, a deliberation was held at a predetermined location. The deliberation was led directly by Melissa, who directly opened the mindset of the citizens who had only been able to remain silent and resigned to being treated inhumanly by the oppressors. Major Pierce, as the mayor, is planning something evil. He intends to turn the region into a new republic, as well as overthrow the president's leadership. Melissa's action gave the citizens courage and confidence. Their hearts were touched, as if they had just woken up from a long and exhausting sleep. As a result, at that moment, they decided to stop the oppression, and also asked for the freedom that had been taken away by the ruler. The next day, the plan began. The father came to the prison, pretending to leave food for James. Reb's men didn't take him at his word, so Melissa's father was told to remove the contents of the bag containing the food. At that moment, he pulled out a gun and pointed it at him to open the James prison cell door. Information on the chaos in the prison was finally heard by Major Pierce and also Reb. So without lingering, Major Pierce immediately ordered Reb to come there before the citizens took James out of prison. At the same time, Melissa's father had problems getting James out of the cell, where the key was apparently held by Reb. So a black citizen named Benjamin decided to outsmart him by forcibly breaking into the keyhole. Just as the cell door could open, Reb and his gang had just arrived in front of the prison building. So when James and the others want to go out to open the door, Reb and his gang, who were standing guard outside, opened fire. A battle ensued. Along with that, Major Pierce also arrived there. He agreed to the agreement proposed by James, and even swore that he would not break his promise as a manly man. But all of a sudden, Reb said something inappropriate about Thomas, so that of course made James immediately go berserk and shoot him. In the midst of the ongoing shootout, it is unfortunately that Benjamin had to die. He was hit by a hot bullet, just for the sake of saving James' life. When all that happened, suddenly Captain Lewis and his troops arrived at the location. He came there after being asked by Melissa to help free James and uncover the evil plans of Major Pierce and his minions. After all the men had been taken down and some had surrendered, James asked Melissa to take her father home, while he himself would end the rest of cases. James quickly excused himself to leave Melissa and his father, then approached Captain Lewis, who at that time told him that Major Pierce and Reb had suddenly disappeared somewhere. Hearing this, James also gave Lewis a map of the location of the secret mining site and then asked him to come there, because James believes that Major Pierce is hiding in that place. After they parted ways, James went to the former church, which was the location of the starting point for the chaos. And sure enough, James saw Reb sitting on the wooden steps holding a knife. At that very moment, Reb rose to his feet, where he still showed his arrogant style and attitude. Even with his rancid face, he insulted Thomas again. This forced James to shut his open mouth up with a hot bullet. In his dying state, Reb was still acting up, taking advantage of his helplessness, and he quietly pulled a gun from inside his gun case. But who would have thought that Reb would suddenly get stuck with a cross from the ruins of the church? Meanwhile, at the mining site, Major Pierce walked on his frail body, entered the armory, picked up a few gold coins, and planned to make a quick getaway. However, he did not realize that when he wanted to get out of there, his steps were prevented and stopped by Captain Lewis. Although Major Pierce tried to fight back, he was eventually overthrown and brought to get punishment from the law for all what he did. After visiting Thomas' grave, James then rode his horse to Melissa's house. Through the window, Melissa smiled happily to welcome James home safely. In the midst of intimacy, James decided to say goodbye to Melissa, where he must continue his journey to the south, to devote his life for people who need his help. Although it looks and seems easy for her to cover her sadness, but accepting James' departure is not as easy as she imagined. Along with the successful overthrow of the despotic ruler and the farewell between James and Melissa, the movie ended.